Before the story begins, before spears are thrown and thrones are contested, there is a silent look between two men who should never have loved each other, not in that time, not in that place, but they loved each other. Not as the world understands love, nor as books describe fidelity. They loved each other as those who recognize in the other's soul a calling that echoes beyond blood and logic, a prince and a shepherd, a son of the king and a chosen one of heaven. Jonathan was the heir, not to just any kingdom, but to the first throne of Israel. He grew up surrounded by swords and promises, trained to lead, educated to conquer, anointed by the system. His name carried expectation. His title weighed like the armor that David would later refuse to wear. And yet, none of this shaped his heart, because there was something in Jonathan that not even the throne could contain, the ability to see beyond himself. When David appeared, no one knew his name. He was just a red-haired boy coming from the pasture who spoke with faith as if intimate with God himself. He felled a giant and with him all the certainties that sustained men of war. It was at that moment that Jonathan's eyes met David's, and in that encounter, the world turned upside down, because there was born something stronger than ambition. An alliance was born. It wasn't a pact of words. It was a pact of essence. Jonathan took off his tunic, his sword, his bow and his belt, symbols of authority, position and inheritance, and gave them to David, not out of weakness, but out of discernment, because he knew royalty isn't imposed, it's recognized. And the Spirit of God, which had previously hovered over his father, now breathed through that young shepherd. How many times have you felt someone else took your place? That what you expected from life was handed to someone else? Most react with envy, resentment, or self-pity. But Jonathan did something almost divine. He celebrated. Because understanding God's plan means accepting that sometimes our role is not to be king, but to support the one who will reign. Saul, his father, didn't understand. Jealousy consumed him like an uncontrollable fire. He saw David as a threat, but Jonathan saw a brother, someone worth losing everything for, even the throne. And yet, he didn't lose, because while Saul held an empty crown, Jonathan carried within himself a glory the world could not steal. There were nights when David had to flee. Saul, driven mad, would order his death. But before the spear was thrown, there was always a word of warning, an escape strategy, a hand extended in the darkness. It was Jonathan, the silent intercessor, the link between heaven and earth. Between the chosen one and the persecutor, they met in secret, a field, a stone, a signal combined with arrows. And there, amidst hugs, tears, and promises, they sealed a covenant that time would not erase. David said, "Your soul is precious to me." Jonathan replied, "Whatever you say, I will do for you." And he fulfilled his promise, always. Loving someone who is destined to take your place requires a courage few possess. It requires surrender. It requires maturity. It requires a kind of love that doesn't compete, doesn't demand, doesn't boast. It requires what Paul would call, centuries later, love that doesn't seek its own interests. And it was this love that David found in Jonathan. Perhaps that's why, even in his most painful moments, David never doubted that a greater purpose guided his journey. Because even when persecuted, he knew he was loved. He knew there was someone who believed in him when no one else did. That there was a soul who chose to lose the world rather than lose its fidelity. When was the last time you saw someone genuinely root for someone else's victory? When was the last time you allowed yourself to be the support, not the protagonist? Write down what's going through your mind right now. I want to feel where in your story this silent love permeates you. And this is where Jonathan's true greatness begins. Not in the battles won, nor in the orders given, but in the way he knew how to retreat, how he knew how to recognize that something greater than himself was happening before his eyes, and instead of resisting, he bowed, not before a man, but before a call. And in that reverence, he became eternal. David never forgot. Years later, when he was king, when the war was over and his enemies were defeated, he remembered. He asked if there was anyone in Jonathan's household to whom he could show kindness. They found Mephibosheth, a crippled son. David took him to the palace, returned his lands, and sat him at the table like a son. Because promises made in love never die. They blossom with time. This is the beauty of Jonathan's story. He didn't rule Israel, but he ruled something greater, his own heart. And in doing so, he shaped the heart of a king. Because David only became the man after God's own heart, because he was loved by someone who knew what God's heart was. There are people who didn't come to stay. They came to teach us how to be. Jonathan was that. A brief appearance, but with eternal weight. Because every soul that learns to love without envy, to serve without being seen, to yield without losing itself, already carries within itself the essence of an invisible throne. Saul's palace wasn't just made of stone and gold. It was made of echoes, of unheard screams, of hurried footsteps behind locked doors, and of silences that screamed louder than any war trumpet. There, at the center of power, something was slowly unraveling, the sanity of a king and the trust of a people. But at the same time, something was being born in silence, a bond that would change the fate of a nation. Jonathan walked those corridors as if carrying an invisible burden. His father was losing his mind. The throne, the peace, the glory, everything was crumbling, and in the midst of it all he had to choose. Choose between his blood and his spirit, between his family name and God's name. Saul was becoming more unpredictable by the day, and David was increasingly a target. What began as admiration became a threat. The country boy was now a warrior, a general, a national hero. The women chanted his name, the soldiers followed him with their eyes, and Saul heard each verse of the song as if it were a blade piercing his soul. David killed 10,000, and there the king's pride began to rot. Jonathan saw it all, and he suffered, because there was no denying what his spiritual eyes saw. David was the future, and his father the past. But even faced with this vision, he did not hate, he did not rebel. He did not abandon, he remained, not out of cowardice, but out of love. Jonathan was not made of metaphors. He was made of concrete courage. In one of their secret meetings, Jonathan looked David in the eye and said, "You shall reign over Israel, and I will be with you." There lay the essence of his soul. He did not seek the center, he held the center. He did not want to be king. He wanted to be faithful to the plan of the King of Kings. But there was risk in every word. Saul had tried to kill David more than once. He had speared his own son. Fear gnawed at his days. Death stalked the windows. Still, Jonathan chose to protect. He created signals. He combined codes. He sent messages with arrows shot into the field as if it were just practice. But every gesture was a muffled cry. "Run! Protect yourself! I am with you, even if I cannot go." To love someone who must flee to live is to bear half the pain of the departed. Jonathan stayed. He stayed with his crazed father. He stayed with the doubt in the servant's eyes. He stayed with his absence. But even from afar, he continued to sustain David with his invisible faithfulness. You don't need to be present to be a foundation. The last time they met, David fell face down on the ground. They wept together until their sobs mingled with the wind. No man who weeps like that is weak. It is the weak who cannot weep. And Jonathan, even though he was a prince, even though he was a warrior, wept freely, because the love that is not hidden is the only one that endures. There are times when separation is inevitable, but there are bonds that not even absence can weaken. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever felt like someone continued to support you even when you were far away? I want to read what this part reminded you of. Tell me how it resonates within you. As David fled, sleeping in caves, begging for bread, feigning madness to survive, one phrase echoed in his mind: "I will be with you." These words weren't just comfort, they were fuel. They were a reminder that he wasn't alone, that there was someone who believed in him more than he believed in himself. How many times did David think of giving up? How many times did the desert seem stronger than the promise? But deep in his soul, there was a root that held him to hope, a covenant, a love, a pact. Jonathan didn't see David ascend the throne. He died beforehand. He fell in battle alongside Saul, fighting honorably to the end. When David learned of this, he tore his clothes. He cried out. He wrote a song of lamentation, and in one of the most profound passages in the Bible, he confessed, "Your love has been more precious to me than the love of women." It wasn't an exaggeration. It was true, because only those who have been loved with this kind of love understand its value. What inner voice did this scene evoke today? Is there a feeling of longing that's also a feeling of gratitude? Is there a love that's departed but left roots? Share what comes to mind in this excerpt. Jônatas died as he lived, fighting. He didn't run from war, nor from pain. He didn't betray his father, even knowing the throne he defended wouldn't be his. And in this paradox, he showed what it means to be whole, to love the truth without hating one's origins, to choose fidelity without denying history. David, now king, was never the same. He ruled with justice, but with the living memory of someone who had been sustained by a love greater than ego. And this memory shaped him. In every decision, in every act of mercy, there was the echo of Jonathan. Because bonds like these don't fade, they transform. The wars in Israel were not just against the Philistines, they were against themselves, against the pride of kings, against the fear of armies, against the darkness that whispered between tents and valleys. And in one of these wars, atop a forgotten hill, the prince fell. He fell without a crown, without glory, without a parade. He fell with sword in hand, beside a father who no longer saw with the eyes of the spirit. Jonathan died fighting. Beside Saul, the father who had gone mad, the king who had tried to kill his best friend. Yet he stayed. Because his heart was divided only between fidelity and truth. He could have deserted. He could have fled. But he chose to die as he lived, whole, without cracks, without ambiguity, loyal to his dying breath. When the news reached David, time stood still. The soldiers waited for an order, the servants a decree, but the king did not speak. He fell to his knees, he tore his clothes, he wept. He wept with the weight of someone who has lost a part of themselves. And in that weeping, he wrote what is perhaps the most profound lament ever recorded, not for Saul, though he was the king, but for Jonathan, his sole brother. Your love has been more precious to me than the love of women. With these words, David revealed something the world still cannot describe, the sacrificial love between two souls who recognize each other in God. It wasn't romance, it was redemption. It was the certainty that someone one day loved him more than he loved himself. There are loves that don't need to be explained, only felt. And when they depart, they don't just leave a memory, they leave a mirror. David saw in Jonathan what he hoped to be: loyalty without bargaining, courage without boasting, faith without fuss. And in that cry, he recognized if he was king today, it was because someone chose not to be. The years passed, the battles piled up, but the memory lingered. Amid the responsibilities of the throne, the alliances, the betrayals, and the victories, David asked a question few kings would ask. Is there still any of the house of Jonathan, that I may show kindness to him for his sake? The answer came in the form of a forgotten name, Mephibosheth, crippled in his feet, living in anonymity, grandson of Saul, son of Jonathan. David sent for him. He brought him to the palace. He returned his lands. He gave him a seat at the table. And he treated him like a son, not out of obligation, but out of ancient love. Because promises made in pain, when made in love, stand the test of time. Sometimes the greatest honor we can give someone who's passed is to continue their mission, to care for what they would care for, to love who they would love, and to remember what they would never forget. Have you ever considered whether your faithfulness today could be the answer to the promise of someone who's no longer here? David fulfilled his duty. He fulfilled his duty not only with his actions, but with his heart. Mephibosheth lived like a prince, even though he had never won a single war. This was because he inherited the grace of an ancient covenant. Jonathan had planted love, and the fruit continued to flourish even after his death. What is a kingdom if not the extension of the heart of the one who rules? David ruled with justice, but with memory, because he never forgot what it was like to be held up when one was down, and this kept him from becoming cold. The throne did not harden his hands. Pain molded him, and friendship kept him human. In times of power, the memory of those who loved us in times of weakness is what saves us from losing ourselves. What bonds sustain you in silence while the world applauds? What memory keeps you from becoming who you never wanted to be? If this touched something within you, express that echo. Jonathan's story is not told in conquests. There are no monuments erected in his honor, no songs celebrate him in grand celebrations, but there is a man on the throne who lived with his heart shaped by his love, and there is a people who were ruled by this man. Therefore, even without a crown, Jonathan reigned. And perhaps this is the greatest legacy of a life well lived, not the glories recorded, but the destinies transformed. He didn't stay to see, but everything he dreamed of flourished. Because heaven doesn't measure greatness by visibility, it measures it by fidelity. The desert wasn't just geographic for David, it was existential. It was in the silence, in the absence of answers, that he discovered the weight of promise and the pain of waiting. As he fled, not only from Saul's soldiers, but from the shadow of a destiny yet unfulfilled, he was being shaped. Not by victories, but by losses, not by recognition, but by persecution. And in this process of shaping, there was an invisible presence that sustained him, the memory of Jonathan. His absence was a void, but a void full of meaning, because there was something in Jonathan's eyes that David never forgot, a look that said, "Even if I'm not there when you arrive, I was part of your journey." This silent certainty was the torch lit in the dark valleys. While David hid in caves, feigned madness in foreign lands, and sought direction amid stifled prayers, heaven seemed silent. And in that silence there was no map, only memory, the memory of a voice that said, "You shall reign, and I will be with you." Jonathan was no longer at his side, but his faithfulness continued to echo as a living intercession. Have you ever felt God's silence? Have you ever walked without signs, without guarantees, without comfort? And yet, there was something or someone that kept your faith burning. Share what came to mind in this passage. Tell us what this part made you think. There is a kind of silence that is not punishment. It is polishing. God does not speak because he is forming. And in this process, he allows losses to hurt, not to wound, but to shape. David learned to wait. And this waiting was watered by the memories of those who believed in him when he himself doubted. And perhaps that's why, when he finally sat on the throne, he forgot nothing. Not the pain, not the promise, not Jonathan. There are friends who leave, but leave behind compasses. There are loves that don't last, but point the way. Jonathan was this for David, a beacon that didn't reach its destination, but illuminated the path to it. On days when the palace fell silent at night, David didn't lose himself in the grandeur of the walls. His thoughts returned to the caves, to the pacts made under heaven, to the eyes that saw in him a king, even before he knew how to wield a scepter. And so he wrote psalms that spoke of loyalty, of anguish, of promises, texts born not on the throne, but on the ground, that were not inspired by glory, but by its absence. Because it is in silence that faith is tested, and it is in pain that friendship reveals itself eternal. David was a man after God's own heart, but his heart was partly forged by Jonathan. That's why his reign was different. He didn't rule for himself. He ruled with memory. with gratitude, with a sense that every victory was sustained by a sacrifice no one saw. This is the kind of love that never dies, that never fades, that doesn't need to be present to be influential, that remains as a structure even when it's already become a memory. Jonathan was this invisible structure, and that's why, even without being in the spotlight of history, his soul still illuminates the backstage of faith. The faithfulness that no one sees sustains the miracles that everyone celebrates. And those who learn to honor the invisible carry the heart of God. The walls of Jerusalem were built with stones and sweat, but David's throne, that was built with memories. His every decision carried an echo of the past, a whisper of a name no longer spoken aloud, but still present: Jonathan. Not in the council meetings, nor in the songs of the Levites, but in the silence between one decree and the next. In the king's eyes, when no one saw him, David became one of Israel's greatest rulers. His name spanned centuries, generations, and borders, but behind his greatness lay an absence, a lack that shaped his humanity. He remembered every gesture, every word, every farewell of a prince who never fought against him, even though he had every reason to. And this is where the story takes on another layer, because it wasn't just David's strength that sustained the kingdom, it was Jonathan's love. A love that yielded, that served, that believed. A love that chose to fade so that another might shine. Not as self-effacement, but as a divine mission. Because only those whose hearts are fixed on God can celebrate another's success as if it were their own. In today's world, where everything is competition, comparison, and stage, do we still know how to recognize those who supported us behind the scenes? Can we see the Jonathans who allowed us to get where we are? If you have someone like that, silent and faithful, this excerpt is for you. Right here, what came to mind right now. Jonathan never lived long enough to see David crowned, but every drop of his faithfulness dripped onto that throne. Because his abdication shaped the king's character, his alliance inspired mercy, his absence taught presence, and this is something time cannot erase. On the contrary, it immortalizes. David could have become like Saul. Power corrupts, loneliness hardens, but he did not lose himself, because there were roots in his soul that kept him connected to what was eternal. And Jonathan was one of those roots, invisible yet alive, remote yet decisive. That's why David forgave. That's why he wept. That's why he sought God even after failing, because he had experienced the kind of love that reveals how heaven loves. The kingdom was consolidated with swords, yes, but also with invisible gestures, with pacts made between friends in desert fields, with arrows launched as messages of help, with promises whispered between hugs and tears. There is nothing more divine than this, an alliance that demands nothing, yet delivers everything. When Mephibosheth sat at the king's table, everyone saw a cripple being honored. But David saw something else. He saw Jonathan. He saw faithfulness embodied in the form of a son who had survived the fall, the flight, the shame. And in that gesture, David was saying to the world, love never dies. It changes form, but it endures. In every generation, God raises people after his own heart, but he molds them with invisible tools, through loss, through unlikely friendships, through pacts the world doesn't understand. And perhaps today, he's doing this with you, silently molding you, sustaining you through others, or calling you to be Jonathan in someone's life. In the end, when names become statues and victories become chapters of history, what truly endures is not the gold of palaces nor the fame of armies. It is what was planted in the invisible, what was woven between souls, what was built without witnesses, like the friendship between Jonathan and David. Jonathan is not listed in the messianic genealogies. He did not write psalms. He did not found dynasties, and yet his name endures, because his love stood the test of time, because his surrender shaped a royal heart, because his renunciation shaped the most profound royalty Israel has ever known. David had many allies, many generals, many servants, but only one Jonathan, and perhaps that's why he cried as he did. Because he knew no other love would be like that. It wasn't about companionship, it was about destiny, about someone who chose to sustain without competing, to love without possessing, to serve without showing off. When we read the story, it seems as if Jonathan disappears, but he is present in every act of mercy by David. He is present in the tenderness with which the king treats the weak, in the justice he metes out to traitors, in the forgiveness he offers to those who offend him. Jonathan did not die. He became part of the character of those who remained. This is the invisible royalty, the one that doesn't demand a throne, but rules the atmosphere. That doesn't need a crown, because it carries an incorruptible spirit. And this kind of glory can't be bought, can't be imposed. It's revealed in those who know how to love when everyone expects them to hate. Sometimes the greatest act of faith isn't raising a sword, but lowering one's guard. It isn't ascending the throne, but relinquishing it. And in that silent gesture, Jonathan became eternal. Not in the Book of Kings, but in the hearts of all who have ever loved beyond measure. Perhaps a man's greatest victory is loving someone more than himself. What inner voice did this scene awaken today? Allow that part to resonate within you and with others. While the world celebrates those who conquer, heaven honors those who sustain. While history records the names of those who conquered, God records those who renounced. For there is a place reserved only for those who understand that the greatest power is not to dominate, but to give of oneself. Jonathan was that man, and because of that, his name will not be forgotten. Because every king after God's own heart will, at some point, need to be loved by someone like him.